Green City Wars is a new release by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and it is marketed as a noir thriller. The idea behind the story, if you haven't heard anything about it, is that you follow a raccoon detective named Scotch, who has been assigned the task of trying to seek out this mouse, though he is given no information on why he needs to find this mouse. But suddenly, when he is tasked with this, he is finding that he is not the only person seeking this mouse out. And this is taking place within a setting where you have all of society still existing with human beings, but we really don't touch the human world whatsoever. We only really look at the Geherna, or the little helpers. We do dive a lot into how society got to this supposed utopia, the idea being that we have progressed to a point where human beings develop technology to make it so that animals could do a lot of the tasks that they themselves didn't really want to do. So for example, jobs to do with trash and sewage, things that maybe animals, if they just had the right means, the technology to push them in a certain direction, you could maybe rewire their instincts to want to do these tasks. And that is where the little helpers, the Geherna, come into the picture. This is what Scotch is. However, make animals intelligent enough, they will realize we can't break rule one, which is the interruption into human lives. We can't impose ourselves onto their lives. We still have to fulfill our tasks. However, they are going to create their own new ecosystem and their own societies, and this is going to be determined by a number of factors. Some of the previous existing instincts that they had before they ended up having some kind of technological advancements, as well as their new instincts and how all of this blends, and the idea being that you have this really fun setup of somebody who is kind of a been there, done that, grizzled character who doesn't really want to work for the man anymore. He wants to set out and become a private detective. However, the claws that are in him through the corporation, they haven't really completely come out, and he is still at their beck and call. I loved the idea of this book. I was really, really excited about it, and I'd heard so many good things about Adrian Tchaikovsky's science fiction that I was really excited to see how he tied a lot of the sci-fi elements, which you can easily tell just by the synopsis. I was really excited to see how he was going to tie those elements in with the noir thriller. And truly, I do want to start by talking about the expectations of this versus the reality, which is that it was marketed as a noir thriller with a supposed utopia setting. So I was really excited for that blend. However, I do think that what the marketing was presenting versus the reality was a little bit different. This is not necessarily a con for some people. I mean, I do think it's a con in general when maybe marketing isn't quite accurate, because of course then you have certain expectations that are sometimes not really met, and that doesn't mean that the book is objectively bad or that it's failing. It just means that sometimes that the marketing isn't matching what you're actually getting. So for some people, they might be happy to know that this is leaning more, in my opinion, into the science fiction territory than it is into thriller noir, because if that's what you've come to love about this author, then you will be pleased, I think, to know that he is still leaning into that a lot more. I do want to talk about, though, what we tend to want from noir, or what tends to be the norm with noir and thrillers, because this is where you're going to find it deviates a little bit from how it's presented. With noir and thriller, typically there are one of two things, or a combination of both, that are really the driving factor for what makes you want to turn the page. One of them is the character. A lot of times the plots can be sometimes fine or even generic, and you still end up loving it because you have such a rootable character, to a point sometimes where you can even build entire series off of characters who are, in this case, it's a detective, but there are other stories where you're following a detective, and you go with them on these new various different things because you enjoy them so much. So at times, you really, really love the character. Other instances, the plot is really, really exciting, and it's thrilling, and you can't wait to know what happens next. You're constantly guessing. You have all these red herrings. You have characters that you're trying to map out who's responsible for what, and you're on your edge of your seat pretty much the entirety of the story. And then the really, really great ones have a combination of both, where often you'll find a character that you can't get enough of, and maybe even if it is a series, there's character development over the course of the story. If you go back to book 1, once you get to book 5, they seem like a completely different person. But then you also have these really compelling plots. Sometimes there's even an arc that's sort of persisting throughout the series, even though there are individual investigations. And of course, there is a general aesthetic expectation when it comes to noir. You tend to get things that are grimy and gritty, and then of course at times you have the subverting of those expectations where maybe you could do something fun with the setting, but those tend to be what people are looking for when it comes to that genre. In my opinion, I don't really think that this book did those things, or at least those things I wouldn't point to as being the main focus or the thing that it excelled at. Rather, I think that it more so was a science fiction dystopian story with the aesthetics of noir. By it leaning into the science fiction and dystopian, it actually ended up impacting the characterization, the writing, and the pacing. Starting with the characterization first, it actually could have leaned either direction of third person or first person. Sometimes when you do first person in these sorts of situations, then you can really tap into the character, but it's not a necessity. So by having third person, oftentimes with this sort of setup, the third person perspective will be a little bit more so third person close. You're following the story through the character. You only really know the story through what they're currently experiencing. It kind of puts you right alongside them. It's not first person where you're in their head, but you do feel like you're standing right there beside them, following with them, and you're feeling a lot of what they're feeling. This also means that it impacts how the world is introduced to us, because there are going to be certain things that the character, when you have third person close, is accustomed to. So there won't be really, really long explanations for things, or if there are, they will be few and far between, or the author will try to weave them into the narrative in a way that feels fitting for when the character might elaborate on certain things. Of course, most of us need the tiniest bit of info dumps here and there, so we're not completely without some kind of anchor within the story. But what you don't tend to have are really, really long descriptions and explanations that our character wouldn't go into because they're already familiar with these things. That tends to be more common of third person that has a little bit more distance or even omniscient. This one wasn't entirely omniscient. I almost wish it had been, though, because I think that the general narration and voice of this fell at odds with some of the way everything progressed, and I'll get into a few points of that. I do want to continue on with the characterization, though. I unfortunately felt like Scotch, who had the potential to be, for me, a really awesome character, especially given the whole setup of that he's done with the system. He doesn't want to work for the corporation anymore. He wants to settle on his own. I was really excited to see this character over the course of the story, and a lot of it ended up feeling like a customizable character in a video game that goes around and talks to various NPCs and also has to read a lot of item descriptions in order to progress through the story. I was wanting a little bit more from Scotch, and honestly, if you asked me to describe Scotch's personality, it would just be depending on the scene, and sometimes even within a specific scene, Scotch would act differently, so I didn't really feel like his character stood out tremendously. An example of this can be found when not only is Scotch pursuing this mouse that he's been assigned to find, but other people are pursuing them as well. These other individuals think that Scotch knows where the mouse is, so they're kind of trying to shake him down and get this information out of him. And he is like, I don't know where the mouse is. And he says, I do not have any idea where the damn mouse is. I am literally working the same case as all of you. I get the mouse, I'll put the little squeaker up for auction, and one of you can make me rich. And on one page later, he says, if I had the squeaker, I wouldn't give him to the likes of any of you. This is what I mean by it is difficult to discern what Scotch stands for, what his personality is, because it kind of shifts depending on some various factor within the environment, which of course people have different reactions to things, and sometimes when characters have moments of growth, they will act differently in one scenario than they would have earlier. But this was within the same scene, about a page-ish apart. As for some of what I was talking about before, as the descriptions really take center stage in this story, this is going to be a plus, I think, for a lot of people. Sometimes, especially within science fiction and fantasy, you really like the world that the author has created, the more they can tell you about it, the better, because you just love getting so lost in it. I gave the parallel earlier of this reminding me a little bit of a video game. I actually think this would make a really great video game, and the setting would be amazing. And also just the idea of you as a raccoon, or even if you were to be placed into a different character within this world, the idea of trying to navigate through the city while humans are kind of off in the distance, you have your various tasks, I think would be amazing. You could do a lot with it, and the descriptions are part of what brought that to life, but I do think that this still ties to that feeling of the narration having a distance from the character, and even a distance at times from the plot. I actually think my preference would have been if we had really leaned into the narrator feeling like a separate entity rather than something that was a little bit more understated, because then you could have been really cheeky. There are a lot of puns throughout the story that are fun, animal puns as you would expect, but I personally think we could have really leaned in and just fully embraced the absurdity and the fun of this. But I wanted to give an example of what I mean by the descriptions. We do get a lot of descriptions. If you can't tell, because he's an investigator, when he is searching for this mouse, as you might expect, he goes from place to place, person to person. And that's a natural way to establish why he would go from point A to point B. And whenever he does go from point A to point B, you get a lot of these descriptions. I did find sometimes they were really long, and that it occasionally interrupted the pacing a little bit for me. I thought at times we could have probably summarized certain points a little bit. So I'm going to read some passages. So some context for this scene. Our character is being taken to this other place to meet up with certain people. And in this area are a lot of parakeets. That's all you really need to know for the setup. So this is the start of the chapter. The parrots had been a mistake. That was the conclusion the genetic engineers had come to, and it was a thought shared by most of their other creations. Parrots, parakeets arguably, but the distinction lacks taxonomic force, weren't native to the area, old or new. However, colonies had been finding homes in southern Europe since long before the green cities formed from coteries of escaped domestic pets and slowly moving their range northwards as the world warmed. Being smart and opportunistic birds, they'd become a fixture of human landscapes, more than capable of adapting their tricks to the novel opportunities to feed and nest. They were a familiar sight in old Vienna by the time the first prototype Geherna were being worked on. Clever, social, dexterous, and resourceful, they seemed an obvious choice. What wasn't to like? What wasn't to like, as it turned out, was that parrots are not wanting to work for the man. No matter how smart humans engineer the birds to be, they could never instill the sort of dutiful nature a Geherna needed. In fact, the smarter they made them, the more the parrots found ways to shirk their responsibilities. There is, Scotch reckons, a lesson one might learn from that. That first part, I was like, okay, I think that's kind of fun, interesting, that the whole idea of the Geherna didn't necessarily work or take for every animal, and also I've got it established that, okay, the birds exist a little bit outside of some of the other types of, not only other types of birds, but other types of animals. Interesting. Not done. There's more. The parrots fell off their service contracts quickly enough so that other guilds moved seamlessly in to take up the slack and pick up the rations and the plangent that went with the work. Plangent is like the substance that they take to keep them from being stupid, and it is one of the things that keeps them coming back for more. Keeps them in line, keeps them doing their jobs. They're highly social, yes. Hierarchical and stratified amongst themselves, yes. Fitting into anyone else's idea of a grand system? Absolutely not. The parrots, through innate orneriness or flawed gene wear, flat out rejected the role that the engineers had set out for them, and yet, at the same time, attempts to eradicate them met with technical failure and the surprising resistance from the human population. In those early days of the project, there had apparently been a sense that once you'd made these things, uplifted your little helpers, they weren't just something to stamp out. You had to live with it after you'd made them to live with you. Or that's the story. Scotch reckons it was more that the parrots were way too smart to get poisoned or trapped, and nobody's fool enough to start throwing parrot-specific diseases around because that kind of thing can get out of hand really quickly. So these days, there's an invisible and somewhat shifting line of tolerance, and so long as the nuisance value of the parrot stays below that, the humans live with it. The soiling and the noise and petty vandalisms of the engineered parrots is no worse than the equivalent behaviors of their natural forebears, as it turns out. And when the parrots push beyond that hard-to-define defined boundary? Well, there's a reason that while the fox and badger strains have been officially retired and aren't being updated anymore, owl and hawk geherna are very much a thing. A haughty aristocratic elite in their high eyries above the city, waiting for the call to go ply their murderous trade where the parrots live, or to cull the pigeon army forces if they're getting too plump. The raptor strains are nobody's friends, animals made entirely for killing, like the stoat weasel, like Tybalt the cat. So, you got some more elaboration about the parrots and how back in the day, the parrots, I mean, I just read it to you, I don't really need to summarize, but you get more information about the parrots. You're like, okay, I've got it. They didn't work, they were too smart, they couldn't really get rid of them, they used to feel humans an obligation to let them be, but eventually the parrots have just kind of done their own thing. Got it. No, we're still not done. Not participating in the human design Geherna system means the parrots have a problem, of course. No regular consignments of planchette are bestowed on them from on high, and they aren't extorting it from harder working animals in the sort of cheerfully ruthless way the armies do. Instead, they just grab it where they find it, neck it when they have it, live without it when they don't. And at any time, maybe 3/4 of the parrot population hasn't had its regular dosage and has fallen back into dumbness. All that advanced gene wear just ceasing to make the proper connections in their heads. And then at some point, another parrot feeds them an ampule of the good stuff and they wake up, remember their words, start acting with that extra level of smarts the Geherna are supposed to have, until they run out. It seems a horror to scotch. Losing yourself, regaining yourself, long periods when the only name you answer to is the cackle call that parrots give each other. Lose all of your understanding of the world, memories locked away, and plangent the only possible key. But then parrots live longer than any other strain, actually live longer than most humans even. He even heard one of them speak about it once, some spaced out sounding parrot in a span of plangent-induced lucidity, as though each side of the coin has its advantages, as though it's a mystical experience too transcendent for some poor unimaginative beast like Scotch to understand, gave him the creeps to hear it. I don't dislike any of that information. I like all of that world building. I think it's a lot of fun. This whole thing is primarily there so that as Scotch enters this place, the idea is that most of the Geherna, the little helpers, don't really go around this area, so it makes for a good hiding spot for other Geherna. That's the reason. You're not really getting into the parrots. The parrots aren't really key to the plot. They're just kind of this thing that has been established as a system outside of the Geherna system that other animals go to when they want, what are basically like secret meetings. So it's a lot of fun world building. It's a lot of description. It's a lot of description. I was trying to read it as fast as I possibly could, but we have these pages from green tab to pink tab, and then when I flip, we go again, green tab to pink tab, and I left a few things out, and then another page, green tab to pink tab. So about 6 pages to tell you about these parrots, and that's fine, but I do think that it interrupts the flow of some things on occasion. This is going to be a major positive for some people though, because even reading it, I'm like, oh, that's such a fun idea. That's such a cool idea. Sometimes I think there are ways to convey these sorts of things where it's a little bit more brief, or maybe have the actual protagonist be a little bit more involved. And the other option, as I was saying before, is that if the narrator has a very, very distinct voice, rather than just telling you all of this information, there can be sort of this cheekiness of them bringing you along, or maybe you feel like they already had that in the tone, but I do think we could have leaned into that a little bit harder. One unfortunate byproduct, though, regardless of whether you liked all those descriptions or not, one unfortunate byproduct is that I think because we were so frequently describing things, sometimes we described things we did not need described to us, to a point where it felt like ultimate hand-holding. You didn't trust us to pick up on any subtext whatsoever between the dialogue, between what the characters were saying or doing. It just felt like you had to hold our hand. There was one example that was, I think, a little leaning on the egregious side. Setting the scene a little bit, all you really need to know is Scotch the raccoon is speaking to one of his friends/informants, who is a fox named Sly. He's speaking to him specifically about this case that he's on, trying to find this mouse. Scotch got a chill when he turns to go, and the fox says, "You look after your skin, Scotch. Someone's making this mouse serious business." That's where I think the paragraph should have ended, because after that paragraph, there is a page break, and then we move on from there. I think that that sets the scene enough, or at least it concludes the scene, I should say, enough. It leaves us with this odd feeling. We even get that Scotch is feeling a chill. So we gather, like, okay, something ominous is going on. There's something more to this mouse. And it's early on, so we're kind of really establishing this is not a black and white, cut and dry sort of case here. Perfectly captured through that interaction. That is not, unfortunately, where that interaction left off, though. So we get Scotch got a chill when he turns to go, and the fox says, "You look after your skin, Scotch. Someone's making this mouse serious business." Sly is worried. For Scotch, but also for himself. The informational ripples that have reached the fox suggest a very big fish. Whatever's going on that Scotch has got himself involved in, it casts a longer, darker shadow than he can know. I personally don't love that. I got that already through the interaction. I got it because you told us that Scotch got a chill. I think that the words are appropriately ominous. Just leave off with the fox being like, I think that this is way more serious than you realize. Leave it at that. This whole, like, he's worried. You're like, yeah, I know, I can tell. I can tell he's worried for Scotch. But, like, he's worried. Not just for himself, but also for Scotch. I'm like, I know, please stop. Please stop telling me this. I got it. And then being like, it casts a long, dark shadow. Now I'm doing it where I'm walking you through what I just read to be like, see, it's so obvious. Isn't it obvious? And you get it. But I think this was a byproduct, as noted, of how frequently we were explaining the world, which I think explaining the world makes sense. How did we get to this point? How did we go from these people within society trying to aim for a green planet, these green cities? How did we go from that to constructing animals and entirely changing them so they serve us? How did we get to that point? What was the rationale? How did it impact different kinds of animals? What were the different strains like? All of that world building I think is great, and I think is going to be a blast for a lot of people, and it really establishes the setting. So I understand the explanation, even if I at times do wish how the information was delivered to us was either a little bit more succinct or a little bit cheekier, but that's a personal preference. However, I really think an editor should have been like, hey, I think you need to trust your audience. They get it. This passage also illuminates just a little bit that it sometimes bleeds into omniscient because it just tells us that the fox is worried. So I'm not entirely bothered by this, though. I don't think that the book was acting as if it was supposed to be only third person close or something like that. I think it had a feeling of omniscience. However, on occasion, we would present certain things in a way where it did have some question marks emerge about how much does Scotch know or how much did the Geherna know? And because we were so thorough with so much of the other world building, there was the occasional other thing that stood out because of what felt like a slight discrepancy. So for example, the animals at one point talk about communism, and one of them calls another character a communist. So, okay, they seem to have an understanding of the types of things humans would describe entire systems of governing and how society should function. They seem to have an awareness of all of these things. How they came to that awareness, we don't necessarily need elaborated for us, unless Tchaikovsky chose to do so. He didn't necessarily, but you're like, okay, so they seem pretty in the know about these sorts of things. But then other things they would not know about. So, for example, Scotch is interacting with a nun, and he has this line about like, oh, but I don't understand why they cosplay as penguins, which would make more sense to have that line if most of the book was told through Scotch's perspective. Again, doesn't have to be first, but was more so through his eyes. And also if they didn't know what communism is. And then there'd be other times where they would talk about things like, oh, this sort of thing was seen in a lot of human cartoons, or they would make jokes that sort of alluded to specific books or things like that within the human world. But first off, knowing those things, but then being like, why is this lady dressed like a penguin? Those already feel at odds. But then there was a part where this little child sees Scotch, and rule number one, they're not supposed to really be noticed unless there are specific designated areas where that's kind of part of the scene. This little girl notices Scotch, though, and he's like, oh no. And he doesn't want her to alert the adults around. So he does this motion, like, shh, don't say anything. Like, he does that. But the way it's described is like, he didn't really know, but he'd heard this motion, or he seemed to have gathered this motion made the humans quiet. And again, I'm like, how much do they know about they know what communism is? Why don't they know what, like that? Why don't they know that? So sometimes there were some things where I'm like, I think if you're going to be this thorough, it kind of invites the reader to then also be that thorough with the world building or with the characters. So I'm not saying like, oh, all or nothing. I'm not trying to imply that, but I do think there were times where the general narration or just the amount of information the animals, the Gehenna themselves have, it was just slightly unclear. I've made the point already that I do think some of the things I've described had an impact on the pacing. I want to emphasize again that if you really like the world building, then this might not necessarily be the case for you. You might really love the pacing because you can't wait to get that next interesting bit of information about the world. However, there was the occasional time when some things would be explained to you in the middle of a high stakes kind of action-packed moment where maybe we could have described it earlier so that when we got the more high stakes action-packed moment, it would flow a little bit faster and we wouldn't have this description or this explanation in the middle of it. So, for example, there is a part where they're talking about guns. They have guns within their society. And I think a way that we could have reworked this is if earlier Scotch goes to talk to some of the people that he interacts with and one of them has a gun, but they don't fire it, but you get the explanation of the guns in that moment so that later when you have the high stakes part and somebody pulls a gun, then that just can happen. The scene can just flow because you don't need the idea of like, wait, how did the Gehenna get these weapons? You don't need that explained to you in the middle of a gunfight. And this is the description. You could have placed, in my opinion, this description pretty much anywhere else had you had a general setup like what I was describing. You obviously could have had a different setup. But it says, Springer leaps into action, dashing from the room in a flurry of scrabbling paws and the stiff plume of her fake tail. In the aftermath, Scotch recognizes that those little pops he heard were shots. So right there, we could have gone from that into the rest of the scene, but we had to then stop to explain. Let me tell you how they got guns. Humans never gave Gehenna guns, obviously. Have no idea that little toys even exist, everyone fervently hopes. But again, you make the critters smart, you give them tools, and need them to understand basic mechanical principles to get their work done, then a certain sort of evolution of ideas is going to take place. The sort that would have given Darwin conniptions. Again, so we also know Darwin, but we don't know, like, Anyway, I digress. No gunpowder. That would be a tricky thing to get the ingredients for, and storage accents would flick the nose of Rule 1. Nobody likes it when the rats in your walls get careless with a match and their arsenal blows up your living room. Gehenna arms come down to compressed air or springs. A bit of simple gearing. Small, robust, and easily produced weapons that a squirrel, say, can just about handle with 2 hands and a braced tail, or that Scotch could maybe level one-handed if he carried one. If they shoot you, needless to say, you know it. Pop guns, the street name, suggests something cutesy out of a cartoon. Problem is, scaling down tends to make things more efficient, pound for pound, the tyranny of the square cube rule. The same math that means an ant can carry 10 times its body weight, which means weapons tech that would give a human a nasty bruise when scaled down for Gehenna use can just about explode a mouse if it hits it dead on. That's what I mean by sometimes the descriptions interrupt. So the parrot stuff, I think that made sense because we're entering a new area, and even though the parrots themselves didn't really play a significant role in the scene itself, it still established the scene, I think, pretty well. Here, it was in the middle of a scene, and we could have had this information slotted in a different place pretty seamlessly, I think. And I still enjoyed the explanation and the world building here. And I like the idea of like, okay, well, if they did have it, what would it be made of? Like, I think all of that's great. And obviously, he has really thought through this world. I just think at times, maybe slightly placing things in different areas would have helped with the overall pacing. I want to compliment again, though, just how well fleshed out the world is here, because I cannot get the idea of this being a video game out of my head. Even that part right there, the idea of in some video games, like if you're going to approach a certain monster or something like that, you have to make different potions. You see this in The Witcher, for example. So the idea of depending on the enemy you're going to fight, you have this like different arsenal and you have to switch out the different kinds of maybe weapons that you'd have equipped at a time or things like that, because you know, okay, I'm going into this hideout. If something goes down, I need something that can actually take out the cat, or I need something that can take out the fox or something of that sort. That would be great. And that only comes about, I think, through really good world building and really well thought out world building. It just, I think, was impacting some other elements of the characterization, the writing itself, and the pacing. The last thing I want to note about all this would be the major theme that I took away from this. And I can't get into too many specifics because I do think that it involves specific scenes. But the theme that I came away from this with was that beings will always find a way to pass work onto someone else. Essentially, progress is always double-edged because more agency, time, and freedom of choice for you is at the expense of someone else. This theme, I would not say, is something that we are hitting over and over and over again. So if you like your themes kind of second to the plot and the world building, you will probably enjoy that. I liked the theme. I liked that it wasn't necessarily so on the nose. I think it's there if you pick up on certain pieces. However, I'm also not opposed to when authors want to be a little bit more direct, and maybe they even want certain things in the plot to stand out for you to reflect on. I think there were a couple things here and there, and that is what I was taking away from the story. Somebody else could have a different interpretation, and also the conversation that could be had from that point based off of the society that's been developed. I think you could have a lot of interesting discussions, and you could use this as a parallel to various things within our own world at our time and place currently. I would have not minded a little bit more in that department, personally, but I also think that so much of what I'm talking about is so clearly preference-based. Overall, if you are somebody who is a fan of Tchaikovsky's world building and this idea of he's going to think through pretty much every single detail of his setting, then I think you will enjoy this book. If you were worried, oh, I like sci-fi more than noir thriller, I might skip this one, I still think that you're going to have that sci-fi itch scratched, so I would still definitely recommend it. If you were looking, though, for a very character-driven or plot-driven story, I don't know how this one would work, but I don't think it's by any means like, oh, it's so bad I can't recommend it or something like that. I still think there's a chance that if you like the idea of a science fiction dystopian with a noir aesthetic, and you like the theme that I mentioned, and there's certainly other things that you could take away from it as well, and you liked those descriptions I read, then there's a chance that you will enjoy this book. It wasn't quite what I was expecting it to be. So kind of coming to terms for me with what I wanted versus what it actually was, I think that's where I'm currently having almost mixed feelings about it with, but still plan to pick up more Tchaikovsky. I really want to dive into Children of Time because I can imagine, based off of the sorts of descriptions we get in this one, I can only imagine what he can do when his gloves kind of come off. That's it, though, for Green City Wars. If you've read this book, you're welcome to share your thoughts on it. If you are interested in it, you're welcome to share that as well. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.